This video is brought to you by your contributions on Patreon. Click here to lend your support to History Education Online today. Hey folks, this is part 2 in a hot potato history series with Cypher over at Cynical Historian. Each week we're going to alternate talking about major revolutions in world history. Last week, Cypher talked about the General Crisis, a period where the world became more centralized in terms of organization. What we're talking about today is where we see a major shift in who holds the power in society. A new class of wealthy people arose, and because of changes in economics and technology, became extremely powerful, in many ways toppling the rule of kings and emperors. At the beginning of this period in the Western world, from the mid-1770s to 1815, called the Bourgeois Revolution, people still lived under aristocratic rule. Even England, after the English Civil War, gave much of its power to the king, lords, earls, dukes, and whatnot. This aristocratic class held its power by owning land. In a society dominated by farming, land roughly equated power. However, things were beginning to change. There has always been a small class of people who didn't own farmland, but made an income as artisans, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, you know the drill. Their lives were often modest, as their entire existence relied on selling enough of their stuff to feed, clothe, and house themselves. Given how long these products would take to make, this was quite a feat. Around the same time, the European powers were also in a mad dash to colonize the world, finding that conquering, enslaving, and subjugating the globe was actually pretty profitable. The colonization led to a massive influx in raw goods and a corresponding drop in prices for those goods, which was far more than our artisan class could possibly compete with. The result was that many colonial agricultural plantations throughout the British Empire needed to reduce the cost of labor in order to make profits, hence the explosion of slavery. The price changes also meant that the market called for many more people in the manufacturing sector, rather than farmlands. We should also pause and talk about some key technological innovations in this period that contributed to the shifting scales of power. Around the 1760s, huge inventions in chemical engineering and iron production made goods much cheaper, and much more efficient use of water power and even steam power meant that the act of making manufactured goods could skyrocket. So some entrepreneurial people changed their tactic of making stuff out of their own houses and instead started buying the materials, distributing it to many workers, and giving them a share of their profits rather than the workers keeping all the profit themselves like in the past. By owning the raw material, the entrepreneurs were entitled in their minds to the lion's share of the profit. This later developed into manufactuaries, where entrepreneurs would have large buildings where they could pay people to work, giving them money by the hour rather than based on how much they made. This was the first time we had people going to work, clocking in, and clocking out. When water and steam power was added to the mix, new machines allowed for more stuff to be made with workers who had less skill. In just a few decades, it was possible to become very rich without having peasants, serfs, and slaves working for you on farms. You could own a few factories, pay your workers as low a wage as you could get away with, and make some mad profit. More on these guys in the future installment of the series. This new wealthy class, just like Rodney Dangerfield, had issues with getting respect. In this period, the idea of working for your money was actually a sign of low birth, and aristocrats refused to acknowledge these people as part of the rich people club. Even southern gentlemen who actually embraced this philosophy were rejected as peripheral riffraff. They often mocked their attempts to act like the wealthy. The new rich did not sit idly as they were mocked by these aristocrats. They developed their own set of values. These ideas consisted of the sacredness of owning and working property, their demands for the right to manage their own affairs without giving tribute to local lords, and the desire to think and worship as they saw fit. It eventually resulted in the book Common Sense by Thomas Paine, who wrote that he didn't see all that much use in kings and lords. All of this led to a string of revolutions through the Western world in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when the British, after the 7 Years' War, refused their 13 colonies the right to expand into native territory, imposed taxation to pay off the king's war debts, and suppress the freedom of speech in Boston. This group said no more. They revolted, using the language they had developed over the centuries of liberty and property, ideas that have roots as far back as the English Civil War discussed last week. The revolt escalated into a revolution, and in 1776, representatives of this class from the colonies declared their land an independent state. By 1783, they were internationally recognized as the United States of America. The new U.S. Constitution, created in 1787, made sure to implement a form of democracy, but one that left out anyone but this bourgeoisie class from voting. Much of the Western world heard about these ideas, which, while designed for the new rich, were written in a very universal language. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, etc. These ideas would be received very well in other parts of the world. For example, in France, where the government was very aristocratic and very unequal, people started to resent their leaders. Again, the imposition of high taxes, a bad harvest, and the resentment of the privileges of the aristocrats led to a very fast revolution in 1789. The French revolutionaries abolished feudalism, threw out the Catholic Church, and established the rights of man and the citizen. This is actually where our terms left and right wing come from, as left-wing revolutionaries fought with right-wing monarchists. The revolution declared a democratic, secular state with freedom of religion, divorce, decriminalization of same-sex relationships, and even rights for Black and Jewish people. The reaction from Europe was fast and brutal. France quickly found itself at war with basically the entire continent. The revolution then began to have issues with organization and rule. A committee, led by Maximilien Robespierre, imposed a dictatorship that executed anyone who disagreed with them as counter-revolutionary. Another council, called the Directory, then took over in 1795, but kept delaying elections. In a military coup, they fell to Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte's rulership was marked by wars, where France conquered much of Europe, toppling monarchies and imposing these new ideas inspired by the Americans. The French Revolution sparked conflicts around the world, and led to the independence of colonies like Mexico and Haiti, as well as unrest in India and China. It would be the decline of absolute monarchies that came out of the general crisis, and the rise of the modern state. Many call this the beginning of the modern era. Following these bourgeois revolutions, we enter a new world, where kings that dominated the world begin to lose their power, and in their place rises a new class of people, the business owners and the professionals who would reign supreme. Would this dominance last? Well, we will have to see when Cypher picks up the story on the Spring of Nations next week. There will be a link somewhere around here when it's up. Do you think the entire world can experience a revolution like this, or are there just too many pieces that aren't connected? Let me know what you think down below. If this is your first time here and you want to see more history videos, subscribe to this channel and click on the eye in the corner to see the whole series so far. Also, my friend Will and I started a podcast about the life as a growing YouTuber, full of advice for growing a channel and making videos. And of course, come back soon for more Step Back.